Let me introduce our esteemed panelists. To my immediate left is Dr. Thafer. Dania Thafer is the Executive Director of the Gulf International Forum and a Professorial Lecturer at our School of Foreign Service Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. We all know her work. We are here because of her invitation. So her expertise is on the Gulf region's security, U.S. Gulf relations, and the political economy of GCC states. Dania has a new book titled Creative Insecurity, Institutional Inertia, and Youth Potential in the GCC, which is available outside, and is published by Oxford University Press and Hearst Company, of course. Additionally, she has co-authored 2 edited books, The Arms Trade, Military Services, and the Security Market in the Gulf States, Trends and Implications, and also The Dilemma of Security and Defense in the Gulf region. To Dania's left, we have Kristian Ulrichsen, who is a fellow at Middle East at Baker Institute and senior non-resident fellow at Gulf International Forum. His research examines the changing position of Persian Gulf states in the global order, as well as the emergence of long-term non-military challenges to regional security. Previously, he worked as a senior Gulf analyst at Gulf Center for Strategic Studies and as a co-director of Kuwait Program on Development, Governance, and Globalization in the Gulf states at LSE, London School of Economics. We have our third speaker. She is joining us online. My colleague at Atlantic Council, Dr. Racha Helwa, is the director of the empowerME initiative at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. She's a senior economist with 22 years of professional experience in economic and financial policy analysis and implementation. She has held roles in the private sector, government, public sector, and also academia in US, UK, France, and Egypt. Her specialties is in public policy design and implementation, sustainable development, impact investment, and private sector development. Last but not least, one of my other colleagues from American University, Professor Ghiyath Nakshbendi, is a senior professorial lecturer at the Department of Finance and Real Estate at the American University in Washington, D.C. He teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in Islamic finance, project finance, export-import management, and microfinance. In his early careers in academia, was followed by more than 35 years working in development finance, sovereign wealth funds, and commercial real estate. And his sovereign wealth fund conference every year is a point of convening for everybody in Washington, D.C. who is interested in that topic. Dr. Nakshbendi has worked in business in 15 countries in the Middle East, in North Africa, UK, France, and Switzerland. So without further ado, I'm going to start the question, the panel by a question from Dania. But before that, if you allow me, I'm going to put the context a bit on the region, on the youth and the technology in the region, which just a few statistics. So the youth population structure in the Gulf region, around 55% are under the age of 30 years old, 25% are under the age of 14. Very young population structure, and only 5% above the age of 65. So there's tremendous potential when it comes to innovation and entrepreneurship with the young population. But on the other hand, the labor force participation rate for the youth in the region is around 15%, meaning that only 50% of the youth in the region are actively involved in the labor market, and that is mainly driven by also the female population. Around 6% of them are in the labor force in the Gulf states. The world average for youth labor force participation rate is around 40%. So if I put 15 versus 40, you understand what's happening. And youth unemployment is around 25%. It could have been higher if there was more youth involved in the labor force, but again, 25% is pretty high for the Gulf region. But on the other side, also the access to internet as a measure of technology, access to technology, it's almost universal. Everybody has access to internet in the region, but only 1/3 have access to broadband, high-speed internet, which is required to do many of the high-tech and entrepreneurial work in these days. So, Dania, with that in mind, Can you address the institutional characteristics of GCC economies, present obstacles to innovation for the youth, thus posing challenges in achieving the demographic dividend, the young population that we have right now in the Gulf, while also considering the potential solutions of removing those obstacles?
Sure, yes. I'll actually stand up for my remarks.
Please, go ahead.
Yes, so this is going to be a completely different topic than what I addressed this morning, probably a more positive one. And this relates to my book. So the pace of innovation has accelerated globally, disrupting and transforming industries, economies, and societies. The capacity to innovate is an essential national security interest. The Middle East has reached an imminent critical demographic juncture, management of which will determine their economic and political stability for decades to come. The Gulf youth population is at its largest in history and are entering the workforce. And how they are integrated in the economy today will shape the economic and political future of the GCC states. The GCC has largely missed the economic opportunities of the third industrial revolution and should be taking advantage of the fourth industrial revolution, which is a fusion of digital, biological, and physical spheres of technological development. During this critical juncture, where the region has a surplus of young workers, it is vital that they harness one of their most important resources for innovation, youth, and in specific, the human capital. With innovation comes nearly limitless potential for new products, services, startups and companies, and entire industries, and a vital element for achieving true economic diversification. It is precisely for these reasons that GCC governments should focus on investing in an innovation culture and cultivating an ecosystem that harnesses the talent of their youth majority. In my book, I coined the concept creative insecurity, and this is a condition in which the state's institutional ecosystem suppresses opportunities for innovation to the extent that it causes economic and political vulnerabilities that threaten national security. Thus, creative insecurity can serve as a defining line between a state's success and failure. A prevalent issue lies in the fact that the formal and informal institution structures in the Gulf economies systematically sustain an entrenched influence of the business elite at the uppermost echelons of power. This structure marginalizes young workers and entrepreneurs, impeding their capacity to effectively engage in innovation. A major challenge for innovation in the Gulf region is the dominance of the business elite. These elite families exert control over a significant portion of the private sector, with projections showing their wealth is amounted to a staggering $3 trillion. And many of these family-owned businesses very seldomly invest in research and development. Despite employing approximately 70% of the private sector labor force, they often opt to hire expatriates in lieu of local youth. In my book, I highlight how elite dominance and distinct institutional characteristics within Gulf economies hinder innovation, creating obstacles to achieve the demographic dividend. Through an analysis of historical institutional origins shaped by social-political factors and pre-oil era dynamics, I discussed the disparities and business elite influence among Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, consequently impacting the degree of state-led capitalism. To clarify, what I mean about state-led capitalism, it differs from the free market in two ways. States adopt it as a strategic long-term policy and view markets primarily as serving national interests. Key institutions like sovereign wealth funds and state-owned enterprises are instrumental, though their presence alone does not guarantee state capitalism, but can be indicative, particularly when they drive the economy. GCC countries characterized with higher degrees of state-led capitalism and minimal business elite dominance are better positioned, in my opinion, to promote innovation-driven economic development, a vital component in realizing the demographic dividend. The high level of state-led capitalism allows the state to execute more versatile and expedient responses to economic reform measures. As for business elite dominance in the Gulf states, the higher the business elite's dominance within the private sector, the greater influence over state institution, and this influence often acts as a counterforce against essential economic reforms needed to realize the demographic dividend. Gulf states with higher degrees of state-led capitalism, such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, have boosted innovation by fostering centralized institutional environments that prioritize youth-centered economic development, emphasizing research and development, entrepreneurialism, and the cultivation of opportunities for nurturing startups. Nonetheless, these pockets of innovation alone are not sufficient to revolutionize and diversify GCC economies while effectively achieving the demographic dividend. A more assertive strategy is required. Gulf governments should continue to expand and develop centralized institutional frameworks dedicated to research and development, embark on labor market reforms, harness human capital, and fortify transparency and corporate governance. By expeditiously pursuing innovation through youth-centered economic development, the GCC can seize the occasion to optimize productivity and possibly take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. Failure to do so effectively will result in a national security risk.
Thank you, Dania. I definitely encourage all of you to purchase the book. I got a copy last night and I reviewed a few chapters of it very quickly, and it's amazing. Definitely youth-centered and innovation-centered economic development is the way for GCC countries and the larger MENA economies to diversify from the resource-based economies, which takes me to the second question from Kristian, that how do you think policymakers in the GCC economies should address the potential risk and uncertainties associated with transitioning from a resource-based economy into an innovation-led economy, particularly for the youth? And I would want to interject here also the female youth, because they are the ones who are not showing up in the labor force, even though they are highly educated, but they are pretty much absent from the labor force as we speak.
Thank you very much for including on this panel. It's a critically important question in the sense that the resource-based political economy that we've seen in the Gulf now for pretty much full-blown for 50 years is going to have to be reformulated to some extent, partly because of the energy transition, partly because of the natural depletion of resources over time, and of course because of the demographic and youth bulge that we're seeing across much of the wider region. We've also seen for more than 20 years states beginning to have long-term visions and plans. Thinking back to Oman in 1995, which was the first long-term multi-decade vision, Oman 2020, which is interesting to look at because it's now past. We can assess in its entirety both the initial expectations in 1995 and the subsequent outcomes, and we can see that in certain areas, such as shifting or at least decreasing the proportion of oil and gas in the national economy, and in boosting generally private sector jobs and moving Omani citizens from the public to the private sector, certainly some of the initial expectations and objectives were not met. Not only were they not met, they were significantly overshot what actually happened. And also at times of political stress, such as in 2011, we saw measures taken to try to build political support for the ruling establishment, which did undo some of the economic reforms designed to try and boost private sector workforce. So I think, for example, we had 4 years worth of progress in terms of moving Omani citizens into the private sector almost undone as many people moved back into the public sector in and after 2011. So there's always a risk that political stability in the short term and economic sustainability over the longer term aren't always working in the same direction. And the challenge, of course, is to find ways for those to align so that they don't contradict each other, especially at points of stress. And the reformulation of a political economy, which has been the basis for the highly distinct sort of bargain in the Gulf states, I think is going to be a moment of stress that we're going to see and already to some extent have seen. Having said that, we saw in the 2010s, especially after oil and gas prices fell sharply in 2014, we did see the beginnings of some pretty serious movements to try to reform some of the elements of that ruling bargain, and there wasn't that level of political or societal backlash that some had been predicting. And so one can hope that that experience has given a degree of confidence to policymakers that they can go further than maybe critics had expected in trying to devise and redevise political and economic arrangements that also address, as you said, the imbalance in, for example, labor forces, whereby obviously women are much more highly represented in universities, much more qualified in many respects, but then have mismatches in terms of translating that into access to labor markets, which again is part of the imbalance between public and private sector. We see, for example, in Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, which is a mix of extremely realistic and policy-relevant measures, such as the policy of increasing the proportion of Saudi women in the workforce from 22 to 30% by 2030, which has already been exceeded. That's policy relevant, it's realistic, and it will have immediate and also longer-term benefits for Saudi society. But then we also see some of the focus on the giga projects, the sort of NEOMs and the line, which one suspects are aimed more to an external audience of investors, of the 150 million visits that the Saudi leadership want by 2030, of turning Saudi Arabia into a tourism and destination hub, which is great if you want to build or at least try and extend the diversification of the economy. But again, we'll need to be more focused, perhaps, to actually create these new opportunities for the Saudi citizens who would need to be at the heart of this progress. So I think communication and messaging is important. Again, in the Saudi case, sometimes there's a feeling perhaps that a lot of the communication and messaging are aimed at external audiences, at trying to tell a different story about Saudi Arabia to the rest of the world, which is, of course, a very positive step in many ways. But internally, people still face new fees, new taxes, and struggles to find meaningful long-term employment. There's been some interesting trade-offs in Oman with designing a new social security net, for example, trying to de-link some aspects of the sort of benefits and kind of system for life to try to explain more closely to the Omani citizenry some of the political and economic trade-offs that have to happen over the longer term. So I'd expect that these will continue to move forward. I think the region-wide experience of the past 12, 13 years, especially since 2010, 2011, has been to increase the appreciation of living in a secure, stable region, that there's less of an appetite now, I think, to rock the boat than perhaps there was in the 2000s before the Arab Spring and the demonstrated effects of what happens when societies collapse into conflict and failed states. And so that gives a window of opportunity, I think, to go further with the reforms that we've already started to see since 2014. So that gives me some hope that there are political and economic trade-offs, that with messaging, with the external backdrop of the transition in global energy outlooks, with greater appreciation that the status quo cannot indefinitely continue, that something different might take its place. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristian. Definitely there are some bright spots in the region. There are some success stories, but there are also some areas that needs to be addressed quickly. In the case of Oman that you mentioned several times, the last time I checked, for example, the reserve to production ratio of their oil sector is around 10 years, meaning that if they want to continue pumping oil at the same rate that they are doing today, it's going to only last them 10 years. So there is this push, this challenge to really diversify and quickly diversify. Entrepreneurial education is definitely central for this kind of transition to happen. So how do you think GCC governments and institutions can collaborate with the private sector and educational institutions to create a supportive ecosystem that empowers and encourages youth, especially the female youth, to become more successful entrepreneurs and innovators, ultimately driving the economy from this resource-based economy to a more diversified, innovation-led economy?
Thank you, Amin, for this question, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm honored to be here with this esteemed panel to focus on the vibrant landscape of innovation, entrepreneurship, and creativity within the Gulf Cooperation Council region. So basically, the GCC region, with a burgeoning population of nearly 60 million, is characterized by its youthful demographic, like you highlighted in the introduction, Amin, diverse backgrounds, and then a notable penchant for technological adoption that leverages the internet extensively. And in the GCC, you also highlighted the high internet penetration rate, surpassing 90% in 5 out of the 6 GCC states, aligning with rates basically observed in countries like Japan, the US, and South Korea. And this notably exceeds the global internet penetration rate of approximately 57%. But as we all know, a robust innovation ecosystem thrives on several pillars and not just one. This includes enabling policies, accessible finance, informed human capital, strong research capabilities is key, well-established infrastructure, and a culture that generally nurtures collaborations among private and public stakeholders. So in recent years, the Gulf region has witnessed a remarkable evolution in its innovation and entrepreneurship landscape. This has really been significant and has been highlighted in every single report we read about the region and the business framework in the region now. And in the pursuit of economic diversification, business leaders within the 6 states of the GCC, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, have been increasingly focusing on advanced digital technologies as a catalyst for future growth. As a result, tech startups have expanded across various sectors, including e-commerce, fintech, health tech, transportation and logistics, and renewable energy. And this rapid success owes its gratitude to the extensive support from governments, increased investment drive in the region overall, growing market demand, and an expanding pool of talented young individuals. Several digital-based, locally originated startups are witness to this success. They've already achieved significant success in the region, most notably the US $580 million acquisition of e-commerce platform Souk.com by Amazon in 2017, the US $3.1 billion acquisition of ride-hailing app Cream by Uber in 2019. They both have boosted the GCC's reputation as an emerging hub for digital innovation and development. And Vision 2030 also sets an ambitious stage projecting the emergence of approximately 115 new startups annually by 2030, including over 45 startups that are expected to be valued at a minimum of $1 billion US. Concurrently, substantial investments in digital technology are projected to surpass 70 billion within the next 3 years, with the UAE alone expected to allocate 20 billion to this sector. So like great achievements, no doubt. However, key challenges persist in the GCC market, and I'm going to just mention a few. The most significant one lies in the comparatively limited investment in research and development across the region. While substantial investments have been definitely made in research infrastructure, so I'm thinking of labs and university campuses, the focus on actual R&D spending remains subdued. R&D spending in the region varies, representing the small fraction of 0.1 to 0.9% of GDP, compared to an average of 2.5% of GDP in the OECD countries, for example. And if we take an advanced MENA economy, Israel, this rate is 5.8%. Moreover, inadequate intellectual property protection infrastructure poses a hurdle to fostering innovation in the GCC. The absence of a unified legal framework, slow patent issuance, and the complexity surrounding patent, trademark, and copyright procedures are the deterrent to investors and researchers. And to overcome these obstacles, GCC governments must really prioritize the enhancement of the research ecosystem by reallocating strategically public spending towards R&D. Increasing incentives for research and innovation can notably facilitate economic diversification, which goes in line with the 2030 plan. And this also is supported by empirical evidence from the World Bank indicating substantial economic growth stemming from R&D investments, including in the GCC market. Additionally, developing robust intellectual property protection mechanisms is paramount. This requires a concerted effort in legal developments, educational campaigns, and collaborative initiatives between the public and private sectors to raise awareness and streamline IP processes. In addition, fostering research collaboration frameworks is vital for the transfer of knowledge. This is one of the spillover effects of growth. And encouraging partnerships between academia and the private sector, both locally and regionally, especially in the technology-driven fields, can really pave the way for innovation development and economic growth in the region. Just as an example, the partnership between King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals and Saudi Aramco exemplifies successful collaboration as they established the School of Petroleum Engineering and Geosciences that bridges academia and industry to formulate impactful solutions. So hopefully this model can be translated into other scenarios across the GCC countries. And lastly, deepening economic integration among GCC member states would also help accelerate digital transformation and promote entrepreneurship. Currently, fragmented markets within the GCC hamper expansion opportunities of locally growing business startups. So business startups initiated in the region. So basically, by addressing these challenges and fostering collaborative frameworks, GCC countries can confidently pave the way to become a creative a hub for creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship within the region and across the Middle East and North Africa at large. Thank you, Amin.
Thank you, Racha. You provide a very holistic picture of the challenges and also the solutions, and a lot of stats and numbers and examples that I have to go back myself and look at the panel again to remind myself of those numbers. But one thing that you mentioned was about the issue of financing as one of the challenges for the startups in the region. So that brings me to Dr. Nakshbendi. How can sovereign wealth funds and their immense assets under their management be utilized effectively to leverage to promote economic diversification in the region, that is geared towards empowering and engaging the youth population. What investment strategies can these SWFs be engaged in? As we know, some of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds are in the Gulf region, and they have trillions of dollars under their management, and which can be used effectively, potentially, for youth-led, innovative, diversified economy.
Thank you. I would like to express my deep appreciation for Dr. Thafer and Gulf International Forum for the kind invitation. Again, I have 7 minutes to cover the beauty of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. But let me start by saying two things. Number one, I am always intrigued when I hear about entrepreneurship, and as if it is the new buzzword. The new buzzword had been known in Islamic finance 1,500 years ago, and I teach that at my school, American University, which I teach Islamic finance. That's number one. So really and truly, the concept of entrepreneurship, it's not new, number one. Number two, I think sometimes we overlook the fact that all these GCC countries, commerce was part of their daily life. They are experts before oil. Now let me go back to the Sovereign Wealth Fund. The term became known as Sovereign Wealth Fund back in 2005. But before that, I'd like to point out that the first fund was established due to the genius of Sheikh Abdullah Salim al-Sabah back in 1953. He was the first guy on the planet Earth who figured out that, listen, oil is not going to last forever, so let's start from now. And this is how the concept of sovereign wealth fund started, by 1953. Now, in totality, as my colleague mentioned, I conduct the Sovereign Wealth Fund Conference at American University, which is the first in any campus in the United States of America. We celebrated our 10th back in October. But in totality, we have about $12 trillion sovereign wealth fund in the world. We have about 150 plus sovereign wealth funds in the world. But in the meantime, I'd like to point out that the GCC countries, they all have sovereign wealth funds with a total of about $3.8 trillion, which is 32% of the sovereign wealth fund in the world. Again, when we talk about these issues, I'd like to point out that sovereign wealth funds, which I follow since don't get the wrong impression. I did not join Sovereign Wealth Fund in 1953, no. But I worked at Sovereign Wealth Fund in Kuwait for 5 years, actually, back in the 80s. And what is interesting is it is a very complicated process. It's a very complicated operation. So to answer the question, Sovereign Wealth Fund, they don't have that kind of mechanics, because I was on the operational side, mechanic to establish a certain activities geared towards financing entrepreneurship for young entrepreneurs. But mostly they are involved in so many activities, and one of which, aside from future generation, they are, especially in the last 15, 20 years, they start focusing on developing the local economy. And I have a long list of engagement of the sovereign wealth fund in the local economies, in addition to other activities, because initially they managed to get their return on their investment by investing in international markets. But recently I mean in less than 10 years, they start focusing on, number one, which is, I was personally surprised to know that, but they started to do two things. Number one, the sovereign wealth fund and the GCC started to cooperate among each other in order to focus on certain investment in international markets. And I can go on and cite some of these examples, but just to give you a quick example, for example, the PIF, which is the Public Investment Bank fund in Saudi Arabia, they were heavy investors in what's called SoftBank. SoftBank, which focuses basically on vision fund dealing with innovation and so on all over the globe. We talk about sovereign wealth fund like Mubadala, which is part of the UAE. Again, they have been investing so much money in futuristic environment, in addition to what my colleague mentioned about Vision 2030 of Saudi Arabia. I mean, just one example, Saudi Arabia, PIF, established about 79 companies as subsidiaries in order to reach and focus on certain sectors in the world economy, including their own internal economy, and they have this investment in about 13 countries. Now, what is important here to recognize that sometimes we overlook this. I mean, here at American University and the local universities in Washington, D.C., in addition to others, we have quite a number of students, bright students, coming from the GCC. And these guys, when they go back, obviously, they have advanced knowledge now in, again, I'm prejudiced, I have to talk about finance. They learn about financing procedures and financing environment and so on. And these guys are joining lots of sovereign wealth funds in their own countries. So the caliber of management in these sovereign wealth funds is changing rapidly. I mean, in my days, we used to rely heavily on expat. I was one of them. But basically, now we are having new generation with knowledge that will help them deal with these matters. And obviously, everybody is talking about innovation. And consequently, they are working very hard in these areas in order to expand the vision in their own country. Again, I don't want to cite for you, for example, their investment in what's called trucker, al-musafir. These are some of the examples that we can talk about when it talk about sovereign wealth fund involvement in some of these companies. So in totality, when we talk about how these countries are advancing entrepreneurship, you have to start with, number one, with government support in general. In addition to the government support, there is a phenomenon which started about 15, 20 years ago, and it is well focused by the World Bank. They identify countries that are doing business in their countries more accessible, more faster, and so on and so forth. And I'll tell you, the GCC countries are fighting very hard in order to improve their status in the world. Number two, which is maybe it will be a surprising element to you, but there is an emergence of what we call in business angel investors. Angel investors, these are people with money, with resources that are interested to fund new ideas and what have you, and it is expanding. Angel investors, in addition to definitely the focus these days in the GCC dealing with digital infrastructure. We talk about internet, we talk about e-commerce, and all these are becoming very valuable instrument by which lots of companies and individuals. And what is exciting here that there is market demand in these GCC countries for these services, and consequently they are flourishing. But the most important is that I like you to keep in mind, the most important is the emergence of talent by the locals. And I was really surprised in the last 5, 6 years. In my old days in Kuwait, I lived in the GCC and worked for more than 20 years, and I visit the GCC every year. But mostly in the old days, and I gave lectures about that and wrote papers about that, most young people, their dream was to join the government. And this is not true anymore. They are not interested in government jobs. They are interested to start their own businesses. And consequently, this is very exciting. So what are the areas, aside from e-commerce? I'm a finance man, so I exceeded the 7 minutes now. But we talk about e-commerce, we talk about fintech. Fintech is a very rewarding subsector which is growing in importance. In addition to healthcare, you would be amazed that customers or clients or patient in the GCC are becoming accustomed to what we have here in the United States in terms of telemedicine and what have you. It is catching up. In addition to that, definitely, which becoming a very, how shall I say it, boring term, when we talk about these countries developing strategies in order to have less reliance on oil. They started that more than 20 years ago. It is nothing new. And consequently, some of the authors, for example, are talking about the UAE in a way by which that the return on their investment in their sovereign wealth fund will provide them with the needed income forever and ever. They don't have to sell oil in order to increase their wealth. Finally, I would like to point out that startups are growing very heavily, and I have very quick statistics here talking about the startup that there are more than 45 startup valued at almost $1 billion and expected to emerge from the Middle East and North Africa by 2030, led by Saudi Arabia. And in conclusion, I like to point out three things. Number one, the young are anxious to start their own businesses. Number two, sovereign wealth fund, not necessarily directly, but through the establishment of subsidiaries and what have you, are working hard in order to satisfy the demand of capital for these startups. But the most interesting is that they are competing in the world market now. They are not waiting to sort of have an opportunity to be involved. And what is the most exciting as a sovereign wealth fund expert, the most exciting is that sovereign wealth funds these days are making investment in companies, obviously in Europe and the United States, and with indirect condition that these companies must come to the Gulf and operate their activities in the Gulf. Thank you for your time, and apologies for 2 minutes extra.
Almost a pleasure listening to you. So I'm not sure if the question cards are still on the table or not. Maybe they removed it during lunchtime. But please, I have a few questions myself. If you have questions, please just write it out and pass it up front. We have about 15 minutes to address any questions that are out there. But let me start with you, Dr. Nakshbendi, again, because you mentioned the youth, and they are not excited about government jobs. They want to go into the private sector. But there's this other dimension of the youth, is that many of the youth in the Gulf are expats or children of expats. So there's that diversity in there, right? And also the Gulf citizens themselves, they are raised in a totally different environment than their parents were raised, political economy environment, global environment, and so forth. So in what ways do you see this diversity in the Gulf, in the youth population in the Gulf, inform Gulf's economic opportunities? What are the challenges that these diversities may introduce? And what are the benefits are clear, obviously, but what are some of the solutions for those challenges to be addressed by the governments?
Well, again, thank you for the question, but really and truly, the question of diversity is a fact, and to a certain degree, that diversity helped to improve the speed of economic advancement in the Gulf as well, and I can talk specifically about Kuwait. In addition to that, I think what is important to recognize that in some occasions, again, in order to change the status of these expats became citizen, which opened the door for lots of activities. But in the meantime, I think what is crucial and what is important is, which is not so well known outside these countries, that really and truly that the countries in question, they welcome expats, and obviously on a selective basis in terms of they need expats that they can advance the cause of their economic progress and economic advancement. In the meantime, they can live in that country for as many years as they want. So there are no sort of restrictions or animosity by the citizens of these countries, which I think it is very important to point that out, that they are welcomed, and I mean, to me,
Thank you.
I consider Kuwait as my third country, aside from original country and the US, because I was treated very kindly and very nicely. And I think so many expats, they have that kind of feeling. So the challenges is, especially with the new generation, Professor, is that the new generation really and truly, and I examined that almost every time I interact with GCC students, they have different mentalities. They have world environment expectations, and they are like everybody else. I mean, they are very well balanced, and they are international in terms of outlook.
Thank you. Definitely, their outlook has been global. I was in Doha for 2 years, and the youth, their vision is not only for Qatar, but for the region, and they're also thinking for the global community. So there's this question, and I think Dr. Thafer is best to address it, but please, anybody else want to take a stab at it. How does the entrenched business elite perceive the entrepreneurial disruption? Do they look at it as a threat for their current business? And what can the governments do to enable and support entrepreneurship and also innovation among the youth, given this backdrop of entrenched business elite that may not be so excited about the changes that are happening?
Thank you for the question. Well, I mean, I've interviewed many business elite in the Gulf. I don't think they necessarily see entrepreneurship as a threat per se, as more so, I think the institutional incentive structure in the Gulf states have incentivized the business elite to not invest enough in research and development and stoke innovation. And the concern I have in reference to entrepreneurship, certainly there's a huge amount of movement in youth entrepreneurship. A lot of that movement, though, is in maybe the hospitality industries, so kind of ways to curb business elite dominance. And I think that more so the entrenched business elite dominance is in white elephant projects that are opportunity costs for investments for entrepreneurship and building big malls and fancy hotels. I mean, I think you can have enough of those. And I think investments should go more into areas that promote research and development and the proper ecosystem to incentivize entrepreneurship and innovation. And I think that's really where the challenge is. I don't think it's something intentional, but also the incentive structure to hire workers at a fraction of the cost doesn't allow or doesn't give the business elite the right incentive to hire this new emerging talent to move these organizations forward. Because we say 3/4, 75% of the private sector is run by the business elite. And so I think there needs to be policy changes coming from the top with a centralized institutional approach to stoking innovation through research and development and creating the right incentive structures for the business elite. And also, business elite, although I think, having a large dominance of business elites in some of the economies does hurt innovation, I think that if the government, the public and the private sector don't cooperate because they're already there, that would really hurt the prospect of innovation. So I think the government needs to cooperate with the business elites and, like I said, have the right incentive structure.
Yes, that cooperation is crucial. There's this question about the American higher education system. And as we know, in the Gulf countries, the mushrooming of American universities in the past decade or so. the sheer number of them and the amount of students they are getting. So how do you think Gulf leaders feel about their substantial investments in this American education system in their countries? And what is your prediction about the future of American universities in the region? So, Kristian, you want to take a stab at that, or?
Well, people forget that this is not the first time that US universities have expanded overseas. In the 1980s, there were dozens of US campuses in Japan. And by the 2000s, I think there was only one left. And they had misjudged the market. I think there wasn't demand that they had assumed. And ultimately, there were decisions made for financial cost to withdraw. What is interesting so far is it's been more or less 20 years, at least, in the Gulf, and those universities are still there. I mean, there have been some that have pulled out. I think George Mason pulled out in about 2010 in the UAE, and there was, I think, been a couple that withdrawn from Saudi Arabia at some point. And UCL withdrew from Qatar, from Education City in 2020 after 10 years. You can argue that they maybe weren't initially of great fits, but we are still seeing value being ascribed to having those campuses and to increasing not only from specific schools, but to having an entire branches like NYU Abu Dhabi, an entire liberal arts school. So I think this is a experiment that has shown over a longer period of time that it seems to be working. It seems to at least be generating added value. And so I suspect it will probably continue.
Thank you. With the educated youth, of course, the expectations of the educated youth increases. They don't take any jobs. They want a specific job, right? And so there's this argument sometimes that this higher education in an economy that does not have the capacity to absorb that educated population can lead to higher unemployment because with the higher expectations of the educated population, not enough jobs available. So when it comes to Gulf states, especially the larger ones such as Saudi Arabia and Oman in terms of population, what are they doing to address some of the economic problems that are leading to high youth unemployment and maybe even some brain drain, the phenomena that we have seen in the neighboring country, Iran, and to a portion in Iraq, that the educated, skilled youth are leaving the country for a search of economic opportunities elsewhere. So do we see any active policies in the region by GCC economies to stop the brain drain or to increase youth employment? And how successful or unsuccessful do you think those strategies have been? So I think this question is very important. So if any one of you can take a 2-3 minute stab at it, that would be great. Dr. Nakshbendi, please.
Well, again, I'm not familiar with the details, but it's my understanding that GCC nationals can travel among the GCC countries. And consequently, for example, I have first-hand information. I have Kuwaiti students who are working in Abu Dhabi, and guys from Bahrain are working in Qatar, and so on. So always the question is supply and demand, and they have the freedom of moving from one country to the other. But in the meantime, I think what is important and what is essential here is that to recognize that when there are issues connected with unemployment, when it goes up at a certain point, which create issues for the country in question, the government will take certain steps and certain procedures in order to lessen the unemployment rate by obviously creating opportunities for these applicants to find jobs in the private sector, and mostly in the private sector, by advancing some kind of subsidies or some kind of rewards for these entities in order to hire these guys. But again, I don't have the data for it, but 9 out of 10, these individuals who are seeking to expand their activities in the private sector or startups I don't think they have issues with these matters.
So you're
But
saying
again, I think all in all, by and large, all these issues are part of the vision, whatever, 2030, 2025, and so on. These visions, it's not new visions, and we started with Kuwait years ago when they started articulating certain visions in order to achieve certain results to their issues that they might encounter.
So, Dania, do you have any particular examples that comes to your mind about the policies of the governments in the region?
Yes, so across the GCC, they have these programs. They call them Emiratization, Kuwaitization, and these are programs to integrate the youth into mainly the private sector. And they have tried different policies to create an incentive for that. For example, Kuwait has issued like a certain stipend, monthly stipend that Kuwaiti nationals could get if they worked in the private sector. But what happened was actors in the private sector would decrease the salaries by that amount. And so that would just subvert the whole policy. The Emirates has some interesting policies when it comes to that. It offers benefit packages similar to government benefit packages for individuals that decide to work in the private sector to kind of avert some of the insecurity or offer some of the social security nets that can keep them working in the private sector and not lose a lot of benefits. Because one driver that pushes the youth towards the public sector is, the social safety nets that you get with those jobs. And I think the UAE has been pretty successful with this policy. It hasn't been rolled out for that long. But so that is one policy that another policy that the Gulf states are pushing forward to have youth nationals go into the private sector.
Right. When I was in Doha, there was this idea that the expats, because they don't have this long-term kind of vision or stability in staying in the country, some of them are not getting engaged in the economy as much, they're not buying property or real estate, which is a sign of long-term commitment to the economy. And so there was this idea that we should provide some sort of guarantee to the expats that, hey, if you buy a property here, your visa status can change, or you can imagine that you can live here for as long as you wish. So, Kristian, regarding that kind of a treatment regarding the expats, right? What can the governments do to increase the job security for the expats so they can commit to the region for a longer period of time and therefore increase their investments?
I mean, what we have seen over the last decade, especially the last 5 years, has been a much more, shall we say, flexible approach, I think, that has eroded some of the rigid distinctions between nationals and expats that we used to see. And so I think the UAE began with the golden visa, the kind of move towards a sort of permanent residency status. Some of the other countries have followed suit. And I think there's recognition, and there's been academic work written about second and even third generation expats who grew up in the Gulf, who think like Khaliji, they view the Gulf as their home, but until recently there was no prospect of ever really belonging. They would go to school, they would go to college, sometimes they would get jobs in the Gulf, but that was no, as you said, there was no connection to a long-term status. And so the fact that we're now seeing, partly because there is this competition to attract talent, especially with UAE and Saudi Arabia, competition to attract global talent, as a recognition that this status needs to be maybe updated, and it is. The risk might be, perhaps, that it just further entrenches some of the differences between high income, well kind of positioned expats, and then, of course, expats further down the kind of semi and unskilled ladder, for whom such opportunities would probably never be available. But certainly as part of the attempt to use sovereign wealth investments to position the Gulf at the forefront of this fourth industrial revolution, it will rely on the attraction of talent from all over the world. And this is part of that, I think, to use the investments to make very strategic choices that can generate that next generation of cutting-edge research, development, and job creation. The difference being maybe how do you then translate that into ensuring that the jobs created also benefit nationals and don't become a point of competition.
Definitely. Somewhat a complex the picture, but a lot of potentials in the Gulf, given its access to a very young population structure, which also means that it's a young consumer market as well. So they can drive the economy, they can drive the demand for decades to come. But the devil is in the details. How to bring the young population with the immense assets that sovereign wealth funds have, with the geographic, geostrategic location of the region, to basically harness all of these things in a nice formula to benefit the region's economy and to move away from this resource-based economy to a more diversified economy. So I guess we are out of time. We have, I think, 5 minutes to the next panel. It would be good to stand up and stretch a little. Thank you, everybody in the panel, Dr. Nakshbendi, Kristian, Dr. Thafer, Dr. Ulrichsen, for your contribution, and I myself learned a lot. And again, I definitely encourage you guys to purchase the book and take a look at it. It's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.